Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you've been following me a while, you know that I have a love of texture and colour and all the things, but sometimes a piece just wants to be a more basic finish. And this table is one of those pieces. So I'm not going to do anything too fancy on this. I'm going to see what's underneath this dark varnish on the top. And I'm just going to give a really easy, simple, hopefully quick makeover. Cut! So as I mentioned, I'm going to find out what's underneath the lovely orangey brown varnish. I started with 100 grit sandpaper on my Festool sander, and that, as you can see, was just not budging. So I changed the grit. I went in with a 60 grit paper, which did cut through it a lot quicker, a lot easier, and you can see that in the sped up video now. So as you can see, this 60 grit is ripping through that finish much better than the 100 grit. Just make sure that you are working with the direction of the grain. So the centre pieces, the grain moves from in one direction, and then there's two little end pieces that go in a different direction. So that's why I've changed direction on the tabletop. And not only is this 60 grit ripping through the finish, it also has what looks like bite marks on the top of the table. I don't know what has happened there, but with this being a solid tabletop and I want to stain it, I'm obviously going to have to get those marks out, or those dents out of the tabletop, out of the wood. So this 60 grit is going to take off the finish. It's also going to sand those marks down, which is absolutely fine to do on a solid tabletop like this one, because you can afford to sand away marks. But it wouldn't be suitable on something that isn't solid wood. And because I've used a 60 grit paper, what you need to do is work your way down to a finer grit paper. Because if you run your hand over a surface that's been sanded with a 60 grit paper, you'll notice that it's actually quite rough, and it can also leave the grain open. So what you need to do is close the grain and work your way down to a less abrasive grit paper. So I am now swapping my 60 grit for a 120 grit, I think this was. I then went down to a 220 grit and finished it off with a sanding pad from Dixie Belle. With regards to that lip on the edge, I have used my Festool to get the majority of the varnish off. This is something that can be done with the Festool because it's got a sponge pad between the base plate and the sanding sheet, which means that it does hug curves quite well. But if you haven't got one of those, you just need to be careful that you don't sort of take away too much of the lip and misshape the wood. And then, do you see there's now a line where my sander can't quite reach? So I'm just taking the sanding sheet. This is the 120 grit, but obviously I've used it well, so it's sort of worn down a little bit. It's not quite so abrasive as what it was when it was brand new. I'm just taking that sanding sheet, I've folded it in half, and that is just going to fit nicely in that little gap and just get that last little bit of varnish that I need to remove. And then I need to flip this table over and hand sand all of the detail on the legs. I'm just kidding. Do you think I've got time for that? No. Also, I have carpal tunnel, and hand sanding does aggravate it quite a lot. So I am going to use Slick Stick, which is an adhesion primer. Now, you've probably seen me use Slick Stick on surfaces such as metal, laminate, glass, plastic, those kinds of surfaces, but it can also be used on a solid wood surface like this. It's just that I am not going to hand sand all that detail. You could if you wanted to, but I'm not. So I'm applying 2 coats of Slick Stick all over. I have cleaned it first, don't skip that step, that's very important. So I cleaned it with Dixie Belle's White Lightning, and then I'm going in with a oval medium brush, which is going to hug the spindles and give me less drippage and pooling, which is common when you're painting spindles. And I'm just going to go in 2 coats of Slick Stick. The first coat I allowed to dry for a couple of hours. The second coat, it's best if you leave it to dry for 24 hours to start to cure before you apply your paint. And out of sheer interest, I did actually time myself how long it took to coat this with Slick Stick versus how long I think it would take me to sand. So each coat of Slick Stick took me 20 minutes. Obviously there was drying time in between there, but I just go and do something else like clean the house. No, that is also a big fat lie. I'll go and paint some other pieces of furniture. Versus I think to hand sand that, bearing in mind how tough the varnish was to remove on the top, I think that would probably taken me a good couple of hours to sand to the correct sort of level that it needed to be sanded to. Bearing in mind I am using Silk All-in-One mineral paint on this, which does require your surface to be scuff sanded first. Also, I did just mention this briefly, but I'm going to touch on it again because it's very important. But using a round or an oval brush for spindles makes your life so much easier. If you notice that I'm working left to right, I'm putting a very, very small amount of product on my brush at a time. The more product you have, the more likely you are going to get drips, and that is just going to cause you headaches. You're going to have to sand them off and reapply your product. So fast forward, I've applied 2 coats of Slick Stick, I've allowed it to dry for 24 hours, and now I'm going to mix a custom green. I'm using 2 colours of Silk All-in-One mineral paint. The first colour going in is called Mojave, and the second colour I'm going to add to it is a really bright bluey teal called Oasis, and I'm hoping that this is going to make a really nice green. So I have already tested this out on a sketch pad, so I roughly knew the quantities that I wanted, but it is approximately 3 parts Mojave to 1 part Oasis. So this is the colour that it made, and I am going to go ahead and apply it. Now, if you do have any texture when you've applied your Slick Stick primer, you can go ahead and lightly sand that texture out, but obviously because I'm a pro, I didn't have any. No, I'm kidding, I did. I lightly sanded the primer first, and then I just wiped away the dust, and then went ahead with a very sparing coat of this custom green. I don't know yet what to call it. If you've got any suggestions on this green colour, please drop them in the comments. And application wise, the same applies to this as it does to the Slick Stick. I'm using a round brush, I'm using left to right motion, and I'm also using a very small amount of product to stop it from dripping and pooling. So I'm probably using less product here than what I would do ordinarily if I was painting a very flat surface. And what that means is I'm probably going to have to do more coats than what I would do if it was a flat surface. So you can see the coverage of this is not that great, and that again is because we're doing quite a dark colour over the top of a white primer. So there's that to factor in. Also the fact that I am using a very, very thin coat to avoid it from pooling or dripping down the spindles. So in total, I actually did 3 coats of this green. And then I'm going to move back onto the top. So I'm just sanding that lip where I have gone over with the green, just so that I got a nice crisp edge. I'm just using a 220 grit sanding sponge here. And then I'm going to apply No Paint Gel Stain in the colour Golden Ash. I'm using an applicator pad, which is the perfect way to apply this stain. So I'm going over raw wood, which means the stain is going to sink into the raw wood and dry a lot quicker. I'm also making sure that I'm just doing a really thin coat of this because I'm going to build the coverage up, but I don't want to wait too long between coats. So I'm just going to do a really, really thin coat. Again, moving with the direction of the grain because that's going to give you a nice, even, consistent finish. And although this is an oil-based product, I am going to be reusing the applicator pad. It won't wash out with water, but if you store it in a bag and squeeze all the air out, it'll be good to go again for your second coat. Fast forward a few hours, so the second coat needs to go on when your first coat has dried completely. Now, that will depend on how thickly you have applied your first coat, and it will also depend on whether you're going over a previously finished, i.e. varnished surface, or if you're going over raw wood. Mine dried pretty quickly. I think it was about 4 hours I left it before applying the second coat. This is just before I sort of lost the light, so I'm going to leave this overnight, which means I can then top coat it as long as it's completely dry in the morning. And the second coat goes on in pretty much the same way. It's just going to build the colour. This one isn't too dark, so it does allow the wood grain to show through quite nicely. Moving swiftly on, so we're on the following day. This has been dry 24 hours, and you can tell it's dry because when you touch it, it doesn't feel tacky. So I'm actually using Terra Tuff as my top coat. And that's because this is becoming my favourite top coat in the Dixie Belle range. And I'm applying it with a Foam and Dandy brush. And as you can see, I've slightly dampened my foam brush with a spritz of tap water. I have decanted some top coat onto a paper plate. And that just means that I can get a really nice even application on the foam pad rather than dipping it into the pot. I'm just going to be able to get a nice even coat on the pad, and then I'm just whacking it on. I'm just making sure there's a nice thin coat all over, again working in the direction of the grain. I'm just making sure there's a really thin coat all over, and then once, before it's dried, once I've got a coat of that top coat all over, I'm then going to very lightly in the direction of the wood grain, and I'm barely touching on at all, just stroke over the top of the surface with the Foam and Dandy brush, and that's just going to remove any texture and give you a really nice thin even coat. And then the last thing I'm going to do with the remaining product on my brush, I'm going to just go around all the edge of the table, which is going to catch that lip. Again, I'm not going to dip my brush in to reapply the top coat onto my brush, because that way you end up with a lot of product on there, and that just adds to any drips or pooling. So this way you just get a really thin, even coat on the lip. And in total, I did 3 coats of Terra Tuff on the top of this table. There's a close-up of that wood grain. Looks really nice. It's one of my favourite tones, is Golden Ash. I think it looks absolutely stunning. There is a close-up of that gorgeous green and the legs. And here is the final shot. Thank you for watching the video, as always, much appreciated. I hope you've picked up a few pointers. If not, we can all just sit and appreciate this pretty green custom mix that I've made. I think it's one of my favourite custom mix greens. It's a bold statement, but I'm going to stand by it. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time.